Arrogant police officer confronts ex-convict after 5 years in prison, without knowing he's now worth $100 million. "Look who decided to show up in our town," said Detective Reynolds, banging forcefully on the window of the black Tesla Model S that had just parked in front of the small downtown cafe. The window slowly rolled down, revealing the calm face of Marcus Thompson, 34, who had returned to his hometown after 5 long years. The irony was cruel. At that exact moment, while Reynolds adjusted the golden badge on his chest with an air of superiority, 3 Wall Street investors were waiting for a call from Marcus to finalize the acquisition of a tech startup valued at $120 million. The Tesla that provoked so much disdain in Reynolds was just one of 7 luxury cars in Marcus's Manhattan garage. "I thought you had learned your lesson in jail, Thompson." "Expensive cars don't suit ex-convicts," Reynolds continued, signaling for his partner, Officer Martinez, to approach. The small group of onlookers that had formed on the sidewalk whispered and pointed, some recording with cell phones. Prejudiced comments spread to the crowd like wildfire. Marcus took a deep breath, remembering his mentor's words in prison. "True strength isn't in fighting back, but in letting them underestimate you." His fingers drummed softly on the Italian leather steering wheel as he observed the man who had planted drugs in his apartment years ago. The same man who had destroyed his dreams as a young entrepreneur with a well-orchestrated lie. The town of Riverside hadn't changed much. The same streets, the same faces, the same small-minded mentality that allowed men like Reynolds to operate with impunity for decades. Marcus observed the familiar facades, remembering when he used to walk these sidewalks as a young man full of hope before his life was shattered by a false accusation. "Good morning, Detective Reynolds," he responded with calm that visibly irritated the officer. "Just visiting some places that bring back memories." His voice carried a weight that Reynolds couldn't decipher, a silent authority that contrasted dramatically with the frightened young man who had been arrested years ago. What Reynolds couldn't imagine was that Marcus carried in his pocket a document that would change not only his life, but the fate of the entire corrupt police force in that city. During the 5 years in prison, while Reynolds celebrated his victory against another street criminal, Marcus had used every free minute for something none of them could suspect. Every hour in the prison library, every conversation with visiting lawyers, every line of code written in borrowed notebooks had been part of a meticulous plan. "Vehicle documents. Now," Reynolds ordered, extending his hand with that arrogant smile Marcus knew all too well. It was the same smile he had used during the illegal invasion of Marcus's apartment. The same smile when he planted the cocaine in the closet. The same smile when he gave false testimony in court. While Marcus searched the papers, Reynolds leaned toward his colleague. "I bet it's stolen. These guys never change." The laughter of both echoed through the street, mixed with murmurs of approval from some passers-by who had already formed an opinion based solely on Marcus's appearance and known past. The hypocrisy was nauseating, an entire city condemning an innocent man while glorifying their true oppressors. Marcus handed over the documents with the same serenity as always, but something in his eyes shone differently. It wasn't fear nor anger. It was the silent confidence of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. It was the look of a man who had transformed 5 years of injustice into fuel for a revolution that none of them could imagine. If you're enjoying the story of revenge and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what you're about to discover about Marcus in the next few minutes will leave you speechless. Reynolds examined the documents with the same disdain as always, but his expression gradually changed. The name on the registration was Marcus Thompson, yes, but the company listed as the vehicle owner was something he had never seen. Phoenix Digital Solutions, LLC. His eyes narrowed like those of a predator sensing an unknown threat. "Since when do ex-convicts have companies?" "Perhaps since they decide to do something productive with their lives," Marcus replied, maintaining the respectful tone that irritated the detective even more. There was a dignity in his posture that Reynolds couldn't break, no matter how hard he tried. It was like trying to intimidate a mountain, imposing, unshakable, supremely serene. Martinez approached, whispering something in Reynolds' ear that made the detective's face turn red with anger. It was information about an anonymous tip that had arrived at the department the previous week, alleging police corruption. Too much of a coincidence for Reynolds' taste. The paranoid officer was already beginning to connect dots he'd prefer to keep separate. The tension in the air was palpable. The people on the sidewalk sensed they were witnessing something bigger than a simple police stop. There was an electric current of expectation, as if everyone instinctively knew they were watching the first act of a much larger drama about to unfold. You know you're being watched, right, Thompson? Ex-convicts like you don't change. It's just a matter of time before you slip up again, Reynolds said, returning the papers with unnecessary force. His voice trembled slightly, revealing more insecurity than he'd like to admit. The crowd grew, and some were already shouting comments. Arrest him again. A criminal is a criminal. Get this guy off our street. The tension grew like a pressure cooker about to explode. Marcus observed the faces around him, recognizing some neighbors from his youth, people who used to greet him on the street, and now saw him as a threat simply because of the narrative Reynolds had created. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the day he was unjustly arrested. Reynolds had found cocaine in his apartment during a routine search. At the time, Marcus was just a 24-year-old programmer trying to start his first tech company. He had just secured his first investor, a promising contract with a local company, and dreamed of turning Riverside into a small Silicon Valley. The arrest destroyed his dreams, his relationships, his reputation, and almost his sanity. During the first months in prison, Marcus had considered suicide more than once. The despair was suffocating. The injustice was unbearable. And the idea that Reynolds would continue free to destroy other lives was poison that corroded his soul. But it was precisely in this darkest moment that he found his true strength. Detective Reynolds, Marcus said, his voice cutting through the crowd's noise like a sharp blade. Do you remember our last conversation? When you said that people like me would never amount to anything in life. Reynolds smiled cruelly, that predatory smile he perfected over decades of intimidating innocence. And I was right. Look where you are now, being questioned on the street like a common vagrant. His arrogance was so great it completely blinded his perception of the reality around him. What Reynolds didn't know was that Marcus had recorded that conversation 5 years ago. And not just that one. During the months before his arrest, Marcus had documented every strange interaction, every suspicious look, every coincidence involving Reynolds and his group of corrupt police officers. His programmer's instinct for backup and documentation had proven prophetic. At that moment, Marcus's phone vibrated, a message that made his lips curve into an almost imperceptible smile. Mr. Thompson, the investors approved the proposal. Phoenix Digital has been officially valued at $127 million. Congratulations! You are now one of the richest young entrepreneurs in the country. The meeting with Google is scheduled for Thursday. You know, Detective, Marcus said, carefully pocketing his phone, during my 5 years in prison, I met very interesting people. Lawyers, investigative journalists, even some ex-police officers who discovered the truth about certain departmental practices. His voice carried a weight that made Reynolds involuntarily swallow hard. Prison had been a brutal university for Marcus. In the first months, he had been just another victim of the system, but gradually discovered he was surrounded by some of the most intelligent men he had ever met. Lawyers who had committed white-collar crimes, brilliant hackers who had been caught by technical details, and ex-police officers who had been sacrificed by corrupt departments when they became inconvenient. Reynolds laughed loudly, but there was an almost imperceptible tremor in his voice, like a predator who suddenly realizes he might have become the prey. Threats now, Thompson? Is that all you learned in there? His fists closed involuntarily, a sign of nervousness that Marcus mentally cataloged. At that moment, a man in a suit approached the group with confident and determined steps. Tall, perfectly groomed gray hair, he carried an Italian leather briefcase and had the bearing of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms and courtrooms. His suit cost more than Reynolds earned in 3 months. Marcus Thompson? He asked, extending his hand with a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. Attorney Samuel Harrison, from Harrison and Associates. I came to pick up my client. His presence immediately changed the dynamic of the situation. The crowd became quieter, instinctively sensing that someone very powerful had entered the game. Reynolds was visibly disturbed, as if he had been punched in the stomach. Harrison and Associates was the most prestigious law firm in the region, known for destroying corrupt police careers with the surgical precision of a scalpel. They didn't lose cases, didn't make favorable deals with the system, and had a reputation for turning arrogant cops into broke ex-cops. Your client isn't being arrested, Reynolds lied blatantly, his voice sounding less convincing with each word. Of course not, Harrison smiled, a smile that froze Reynolds' blood. But I thought you'd like to know that my client has just been appointed by the governor to the new Prison System Reform Commission. And curiously, the first case under investigation involves irregularities in this department. He opened the briefcase and took out an official document with the state seal. The color completely drained from Reynolds' face. Marcus observed the transformation with silent satisfaction, remembering the sleepless nights in prison when he planned exactly this moment. For 2 years in prison, he had known Harrison through an innovative rehabilitation program where volunteer lawyers helped prisoners develop business skills. The lawyer had been impressed not only with Marcus's intelligence, but with his determination to use technology to revolutionize the justice system. Harrison wasn't there by chance. He had been carefully cultivated by Marcus for years, first as a mentor, then as an ally, and finally as the instrument of his revenge. Every conversation in prison, every project they developed together, every legal strategy they discussed had been part of a larger plan that was now beginning to reveal itself in all its terrible magnificence. Furthermore, Harrison continued, his voice cutting to the tense air like a judicial sentence, my client meticulously documented every interaction with this department over the past 5 years. Recordings, photographs, communication records, forensic analyses of planted evidence, all properly authenticated by independent experts and presented to the competent authorities. The mention of planted evidence made Martinez involuntarily step back. The officer knew exactly what Harrison was talking about, and panic began to settle in his eyes. The corruption network they thought was invincible was beginning to reveal itself as a spider web exposed to the implacable light of justice. Marcus took out his phone again and showed a screen that made Reynolds audibly swallow. It was an elegantly designed app called Justice Track, a platform Marcus had secretly developed in prison to help ex-convicts and ordinary citizens document cases of police harassment and corruption. The app already had over 100,000 active users in 15 states, each contributing data that formed a national map of police corruption. You see, Detective Reynolds, Marcus said, his voice now loaded with an authority that didn't exist 5 years ago, like a king finally reclaiming his throne. While you thought you were destroying my life, I was building an empire based on justice. Phoenix Digital Solutions doesn't just develop commercial apps. We develop tools to expose systemic corruption. Martinez whispered something urgently in Reynolds' ear, pointing to crowd cell phones. Everything was being recorded and broadcast live on social media. Hashtag Justice for Marcus was beginning to go viral. Reynolds tried one last desperate move. But what happened next left the entire city in shock and showed that Marcus had saved his most devastating weapon for last. Marcus smiled for the first time, a smile that froze Reynolds' blood like Arctic wind in the middle of summer. It was a smile of a man who had spent 5 years planning this exact moment. Every detail meticulously calculated, every move anticipated. Maybe you should ask the FBI about that. As if summoned by his words, 3 black vans simultaneously stopped on the street with the military precision of a long-planned operation. Federal agents quickly descended, their boots hammering on the asphalt with unquestionable authority, bulletproof vests marked with FBI in yellow letters that gleamed under the sunlight like a seal of condemnation. Special Agent Sarah Chin approached with firm steps, her golden badge glinting as she showed it to the now silent crowd. At 38, Chen had dedicated her career to dismantling police corruption networks, and Reynolds was about to discover he had become her primary target longer than he could imagine. Detective James Reynolds. Her voice cut to the air like a final sentence, each word heavy with federal authority. You are under arrest for corruption, planting evidence, extortion, conspiracy to commit federal crimes, and violation of the civil rights of 23 citizens. Her voice was cold, professional, implacable. And before you ask how we found out, your informant has been working for us for 2 years. Reynolds felt the world crumble around him like a house of cards in a storm. His eyes desperately turned to Martinez. seeking support, denial, anything that could contradict the nightmare unfolding. Martinez looked away with guilt stamped on his face like a silent confession. The officer had turned FBI informant after Reynolds tried to blackmail him over his growing gambling debts at the local Indian casino. The betrayal cut Reynolds deeper than any arrest could. Martinez wasn't just his partner. He was his protege, someone he had personally recruited into the corruption scheme, someone he trusted implicitly. Discovering that his own weapon had been turned against him was a humiliation that transcended any legal punishment. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Chun continued with the coldness of a protocol executed thousands of times, but Reynolds interrupted her with growing desperation in his voice. "Wait, wait!" Reynolds shouted, his composure finally shattering like glass. "This is a setup." He orchestrated all of this. He pointed at Marcus with visibly trembling hands, sweat beginning to drip down his forehead. "Can't you see? He planned everything. It's revenge." Marcus took out his phone with deliberately slow movements and played an audio file. Reynolds' recorded voice echoed clearly through the silent crowd, each word a condemnation that resonated through the streets like an echo from the past. "People like you will never amount to anything in life, Thompson. I personally will make sure of that. And if you try to report anything, I'll plant so much drugs in your house that you'll rot in jail until you die." The crowd fell into absolute silence, a silence so deep you could hear the wind whispering through the trees. Even those who had shouted against Marcus minutes before now looked at Reynolds with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. The brutal reality of the situation began to penetrate their consciousness, like ink spreading in water. Other voices began playing from Marcus's phone. Conversations revealing the depth of Reynolds' corruption. Discussions about how to plant evidence, how to choose vulnerable targets, how to silence inconvenient witnesses. It was a symphony of guilt that had been orchestrated over years of arrogance and impunity. "This recording," Agent Chin said, her voice cutting through confusion, along with 47 other similar pieces of evidence, documented a corruption scheme that lasted over a decade. "You planted drugs on at least 23 innocent citizens, mostly young Black and Latino men, destroying lives, families, entire futures based on lies and prejudice." Reynolds tried to resist arrest with the desperation of a cornered animal, but was quickly overpowered by trained agents. As the handcuffs closed around his wrist with a final and definitive click, he screamed with a breaking voice, "You don't know who you're messing with, Thompson. I have friends in high places. This won't end here." Marcus calmly approached the police van window where Reynolds was being placed. His steps were measured, controlled, the steps of a man who had finally reached the moment he had visualized thousands of times during lonely nights in prison. "Detective Reynolds," he said with a calm that brutally contrasted with the desperation of the handcuffed man. "During 5 years in prison, I made 3 sacred promises to myself." He paused, allowing the silence to amplify the weight of his next words. "First, to come out stronger than anything you could imagine. Second, to build an empire that would make your small power irrelevant. Third, to ensure that men like you never again destroy innocent lives with impunity." He showed his phone screen with a calculated theatrical movement. It was a live news app showing headlines appearing in real time like digital fireworks. "Millionaire businessman exposes police corruption. Ex-convict reveals drug planting scheme. Phoenix Digital, the company that revolutionized the fight against injustice." The notifications wouldn't stop coming, each one amplifying the national scandal that was unfolding. "By the way," Marcus added with the cold satisfaction of someone executing the final blow, "Phoenix Digital just received an acquisition offer of $180 million from Google. We're going to use that money to expand our justice app to all 50 states, creating a national network of transparency that will make it impossible for other Reynolds to operate with impunity." Reynolds tried to scream something else, but his voice was lost in the crowd's roar that now applauded Marcus. The irony was poetically cruel. In the same place where he had been publicly humiliated years ago, Marcus now received a standing ovation while his oppressor was taken away in disgrace. As the van took Reynolds away, sirens wailing like a requiem for his destroyed career, the crowd began applauding Marcus with growing enthusiasm. But the true magnitude of his revenge would only be understood in the coming days, when the full extent of his 5-year strategy would be revealed in its terrible and 6 months later, Marcus was sitting in his office on the 40th floor of a New York skyscraper, observing the city through panoramic windows that stretched from floor to ceiling. The view was impressive, an urban sea of possibilities extending to the horizon. Phoenix Digital had become one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country, with the Justice Track app being used by over 2 million people in all 50 states, each download representing a life potentially protected from injustice. The transformation had been meteoric. From humiliated ex-convict on the streets of Riverside to CEO of one of America's most valuable startups, Marcus had rewritten not only his own story, but also the national narrative about second chances and social justice. Business magazines called him the Digital Avenger, while civil rights activists saw him as a modern hero. Detective Reynolds was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole, a sentence that echoed like thunder through corrupt police departments across the country. 17 other officers from the same department were also arrested in an operation that became known as Operation Phoenix, a direct reference to Marcus's company that had risen from the ashes of his own destruction. But justice didn't stop at the arrests. The 23 identified victims of the drug planning scheme received compensation totaling over $50 million, paid by the city of Riverside itself, which was forced to sell municipal properties to cover the costs. Each payment came with a formal public apology and acknowledgement of the injustice suffered. Marcus had created the Phoenix Fund, with an initial investment of $50 million from his own pocket, a sum that represented more money than Reynolds had earned in his entire corrupt career. The fund had already helped over 10,000 ex-convicts rebuild their lives through education, professional training, small business loans, and most importantly, restore dignity. The social impact was immeasurable. Universities began studying the Phoenix model of rehabilitation and empowerment. The Justice Track app had identified and helped prosecute over 500 cases of police misconduct in just 6 months, creating a national network of transparency that was fundamentally transforming the relationship between citizens and law enforcement. The final irony came in a yellowed letter Marcus received at the prison where Reynolds was serving time, a handwritten letter in shaky handwriting that revealed the former detective's deteriorated mental state. Reynolds had written asking for forgiveness, claiming he now understood what it was like to be treated unjustly by the system, what it was like to lose everything because of lies and corruption. The letter ended with a desperate plea for a second chance. Marcus read the letter 3 times, then stored it in a drawer without responding. Some lessons he had learned need be absorbed in the solitude of one's own error. Forgiveness might come eventually, but justice demanded that Reynolds fully face the consequences of his actions, just as Marcus had faced the consequences of Reynolds' lies. Sarah Chun, the FBI agent who had led the investigation, visited Marcus in his office on a rainy Thursday afternoon. "Did you know Reynolds attempted suicide in federal prison last week?" she asked, carefully observing Marcus's reaction. Marcus stopped typing on his custom laptop and looked out the window, watching raindrops slide down the glass like tears from the sky. "I don't wish him harm, Agent Chun," he replied after a long, reflective pause. "But I also can't feel sorry for someone who destroyed so many lives without showing a shred of remorse for decades. He's facing the consequences of his own choices." The Justice Track app identified 300 more suspicious cases of police corruption in 12 different states just this month, Chin continued, flipping through a thick report. "Your work is fundamentally revolutionizing how we deal with systemic injustices. The Department of Justice is considering making the app's use mandatory for all departments receiving federal funding." The conversation was interrupted by a notification on Marcus's phone. A new Justice Track update showed the app had just reached 3 million users, with misconduct reports being processed in real time by a network of volunteer lawyers and civil rights organizations. That night, Marcus decided to return to his hometown for the first time since the epic confrontation with Reynolds. He drove through familiar streets in his new Tesla Roadster, an upgrade from a model that had caused so much commotion months ago, and stopped at the same cafe where it all began. The establishment's owner, Mr. Martinez, father of the ex-police officer who had become an FBI informant, approached with tears streaming freely down his wrinkled face. His hands trembled as he nervously wiped a glass that was already clean. Mr. Thompson, his voice broke with emotion. I want to apologize from the bottom of my heart. My son told me the whole truth about what really happened. I was in that crowd shouting against you, call you a criminal, and now I know you were completely innocent. Forgive a foolish old man. Marcus smiled with genuine compassion, remembering his prison mentor's words about how forgiveness frees the forgiver more than the forgiven. Your son did the right thing in the end, Mr. Martinez. He had the courage to face a corrupt system and help protect innocent people. That's what really matters. We all deserve a second chance to do what's right. As he left the cafe, Marcus received a message that made him stop on the sidewalk. It was from a 19-year-old from Detroit. Mr. Thompson, I was wrongfully arrested last week by an officer who planted drugs in my car. I used your app to document everything from the first moment. The lawyers say I have a solid case and that the officer was already being investigated for other similar cases. Thank you for giving me hope when I thought my life was over. Marcus typed his response with fingers that had learned to transform suffering into strength. The truth always wins in the end, even when it takes time to appear. Keep documenting, keep fighting, keep believing. You're not alone in this battle. As he drove back to the airport, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary journey that had taken him from this moment of total humiliation to the top of the business world. He had learned that the best revenge isn't destroying those who hurt you, but building something so powerful and positive that it makes it impossible for others to suffer the same injustice. Reynolds had tried to bury Marcus, but like the phoenix legend that inspired his company's name, he didn't know he was planting a seed that would grow and become a giant tree of justice, protecting thousands of other people with a protective shadow. If you were inspired by this story of overcoming justice and transformation, subscribe to the channel for more narratives that show how true strength comes from intelligence, determination, and compassion, not from blind revenge or destructive hatred. Because sometimes the best response to those who try to destroy you is simply become indestructible and use that strength to protect others who haven't yet found their own.